Hello, if you like these videos, don't forget to push the like button, share them with your friends, and subscribe. Moon's cat is hiding somewhere in this video. If you find him, there's a prize. This story is dedicated to Augustus. Out of the Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis. Part 6. Read for you today by Yuga. Ransom awoke next morning with the vague feeling that a great weight had been taken off his mind. Then he remembered that he was the guest of a sorn, and that the creature he had been avoiding ever since he landed had turned out to be as amicable as the Oasa, though he was far from feeling the same affection for it. Nothing then remained to be afraid of in Malacandra except Oasa. The last fence, thought Ransom. Algrey gave him food and drink. "And now," said Ransom, "how shall I find my way to Oasa?"
"I will carry you,"
said the sorn.
"You are too small a one to make the journey yourself, and I will gladly go to Meldilorn. The Oasa should not have sent you this way. They do not seem to know from looking at an animal what sort of lungs it has and what it can do. It is just like a Oasa. If you died on the Harandra, they would have made a poem about the gallant man and how the sky grew black and the cold stars shone, and he journeyed on and journeyed on. And they would have put in a fine speech for you to say as you were dying. And all this would seem to them just as good as if they had used a little forethought and saved your life by sending you the easier way round."
"I like the Oasa," said Ransom a little stiffly, "and I think the way they talk about death is the right way."
"They are right not to fear it, Ransom. But they do not seem to look at it reasonably, as part of the very nature of our bodies, and therefore often avoidable at times when they would never see how to avoid it. For example, this has saved the life of many a Ross, but a Ross would not have thought of it."
He showed Ransom a flask with a tube attached to it, and at the end of the tube a cup, obviously an apparatus for administering oxygen to oneself.
"Smell on it as you have the need, small one," said the sorn, "and close it up when you do not."
Algrey fastened the thing on his back and gave the tube over his shoulder into his hand. Ransom could not restrain a shudder at the touch of the sorn's hands upon his body. They were fan-shaped, 7-fingered, mere skin over bone like a bird's leg, and quite cold. To divert his mind from such reactions, he asked where the apparatus was made, for he had as yet seen nothing remotely like a factory or a laboratory.
"We thought it," said the
sorn,
"and the petrified made it."
"Why do they make them?" said Ransom. He was trying once more with his insufficient vocabulary to find out the political and economic framework of Malacandrian life.
"They like making things," said
Algrey.
"It is true they like best the making of things that are only good to look at and of no use. But sometimes when they are tired of that, they will make things for us, things we have thought, provided they are difficult enough. They have not patience to make easy things, however useful they would be. But let us begin our journey. You shall sit on my shoulder."
The proposal was unexpected and alarming, but seeing that the sorn had already crouched down, Ransom felt obliged to climb onto the plume-like surface of its shoulder, to seat himself beside the long, pale face, casting his right arm as far as it would go round the huge neck, and to compose himself as well as he could for this precarious mode of travel. The giant rose cautiously to a standing position, and he found himself looking down on the landscape from a height of about 18 feet.
"Is all well, small one?"
it asked.
"Very well,"
Ransom answered, and the journey began. Its gait was perhaps the least human thing about it. It lifted its feet very high and set them down very gently. Ransom was reminded alternately of a cat stalking, a strutting barn door fowl, and a high-stepping carriage horse. But the movement was not really like that of any terrestrial animal. For the passenger, it was surprisingly comfortable. In a few minutes he had lost all sense of what was dizzying or unnatural in his position. Instead, ludicrous and even tender associations came crowding into his mind. It was like riding an elephant at the zoo in boyhood, like riding on his father's back at a still earlier age. It was fun. They seemed to be doing about 6 and 7 miles an hour. The cold, though severe, was endurable, and thanks to the oxygen he had little difficulty with his breathing. The landscape which he saw from his high swaying post of observation was a solemn one. The Handramit was nowhere to be seen. On each side of the shallow gully in which they were walking, a world of naked, faintly greenish rock interrupted with wide patches of red extended to the horizon. The heaven, darkest blue where the rock met it, was almost black at the zenith, and looking in any direction where sunlight did not blind him, he could see the stars. He learned from the sorn that he was right in thinking they were near the limits of the breathable. Already on the mountain fringe, the borders of the Harandra and walls of the Handramit, or in the narrow depression along which their road led them, the air was of Himalayan rarity. Ill-breathing for a Haros, and a few 100 feet higher, on the Harandra proper, the true surface of the planet, it admits no life. Hence the brightness through which they walked was almost that of heaven, celestial light hardly at all tempered with an atmospheric veil. The shadow of the sorn, with Ransom's shadow on its shoulder, moved over the uneven rock unnaturally distinct, like the shadow of a tree before the headlights of a car, and the rock beyond the shadow hurt his eyes. The remote horizon seemed but an arm's length away. The fissures and moulding of distant slopes were clear as the background of a primitive picture made before men learned perspective. He was on the very frontier of that heaven he had known in the spaceship, and rays that the air-enveloped worlds cannot taste were once more at work upon his body. He felt the old lift of the heart, the soaring solemnity, the sense, at once sober and ecstatic, of life and power offered in unasked and unmeasured abundance. If there had been air enough in his lungs, he would have laughed aloud. And now, even in the immediate landscape, beauty was drawing near. Over the edge of the valley, as if it had frothed down from the true Harandra, came great curves of the rose-tinted cumulus stuff which he had seen so often from a distance. Now on a nearer view they appeared hard as stone in substance, but puffed above and stalked beneath like vegetation. His original simile of giant cauliflower turned out to be surprisingly correct. Stone cauliflowers the size of cathedrals and the colour of pale rose. He asked the sorn what it was.
"It is the old forests of Malacandra,"
said Owl Grey.
"Once there was air on the Harandra, and it was warm. To this day, if you could get up there and live, you would see it all covered with the bones of ancient creatures. It was once full of life and noise. It was then these forests grew, and in and out among their stalks went a people that have vanished from the world these many thousand years. They were covered not with fur, but with a coat like mine. They did not go in the water swimming, or on the ground walking. They glided in the air on broad, flat limbs which kept them up. It is said they were great singers, and in those days the red forests echoed with their music. Now the forests have become stone, and only Eldila can go among them.
We still have such creatures in our world,
said Ransom.
We call them birds. Where was Oasa when all this happened to the Harandra?
Where he is now.
And he could not prevent it?
I do not know, but a world is not made to last forever, much less a race. That is not Mal-Eldil's way.
As they proceeded, the petrified forests grew more numerous, and often for half an hour at a time the whole horizon of the lifeless, almost airless waste blushed like an English garden in summer. They passed many caves where, as Algray told him, Sorns lived. Sometimes a high cliff would be perforated with countless holes to the very top, and unidentifiable noises came hollowly from within. Work was in progress, said the Sorn, but of what kind it could not make him understand. Its vocabulary was very different from that of the Oasa. Nowhere did he see anything like a village or city of Sorns, who were apparently solitary, not social creatures. Once or twice a long, pallid face would show from a cavern mouth and exchange a horn-like greeting with the travellers. But for the most part, the long valley, the rock street of the silent people, was still and empty as the Harandra itself. Only towards afternoon, as they were about to descend into a dip of the road, they met three Sorns together coming towards them down the opposite slope. They seemed to Ransom to be rather skating than walking. The lightness of their world and the perfect poise of their bodies allowed them to lean forward at right angles to the slope, and they came swiftly down like full-rigged ships before a fair wind. The grace of their movement, their lofty stature, and the softened glancing of the sunlight on their feathery sides effected a final transformation in Ransom's feelings towards their race. Ogres, he had called them, when they first met his eyes as he struggled in the grip of Western and Divine. Titans, or angels, he now thought, would have been a better word. Even the faces, it seemed to him, he had not then seen aright. He had thought them spectral, when they were only august, and his first human reaction to their lengthened severity of line and profound stillness of expression now appeared to him not so much cowardly as vulgar. So might Parmenides or Confucius look to the eyes of a Cockney schoolboy. The great white creatures sailed towards Ransom and Algray, and dipped like trees and passed. In spite of the cold, which made him often dismount and take a spell on foot, he did not wish for the end of the journey. But Algray had his own plans and halted for the night long before sundown, at the home of an older Sorn. Ransom saw well enough that he was brought there to be shown to a great scientist. The cave, or to speak more correctly, the system of excavations, was large and many-chambered, and contained a multitude of things that he did not understand. He was especially interested in a collection of rolls, seemingly of skin, covered with characters which were clearly books. But he gathered that books were few in Malacandra.
"It is better to remember,"
said the Sorns. When Ransom asked if valuable secrets might not thus be lost, they replied that Oasa always remembered them, and would bring them to light if he thought fit.
The Rossa used to have many books of poetry,
they added,
but now they have fewer. They say that the writing of books destroys poetry.
Their host in these caverns was attended by a number of other Sorns who seemed to be in some way subordinate to him. Ransom thought at first that they were servants, but decided later that they were pupils or assistants. The evening's conversation was not such as would interest a terrestrial reader, for the Sorns had determined that Ransom should not ask, but answer questions. Their questioning was very different from the rambling, imaginative inquiries of the Rossa. They worked systematically, from the geology of Earth to its present geography, and thence in turn to flora, fauna, human history, languages, politics, and arts. When they found that Ransom could tell them no more on a given subject, and this happened pretty soon in most of their inquiries, they dropped it at once and went on to the next. Often they drew out of him indirectly much more knowledge than he consciously possessed, apparently working from a wide background of general science. A casual remark about trees when Ransom was trying to explain the manufacture of paper would fill up for them a gap in his sketchy answers to their botanical questions. His account of terrestrial navigation might illuminate mineralogy, and his description of the steam engine gave them a better knowledge of terrestrial air and water than Ransom had ever had. He had decided from the outset that he would be quite frank, for he now felt that it would not be now, and also that it would be unavailing to do otherwise. They were astonished at what he had to tell them of human history, of war, slavery, and prostitution.
"It is because they have no Oasa,"
said one of the pupils.
It is because every one of them wants to be a little Oasa himself,
said Augrey.
They cannot help it,
said the old Sorn.
There must be rule. Yet how can creatures rule themselves? Beasts must be ruled by Now, and Now by Eldila, and Eldila by Meldilorn. These creatures have no Eldila. They are like one trying to lift himself by his own hair, or one trying to see over a whole country when he is on a level with it, like a female trying to beget young on herself.
Two things about our world particularly stuck in their minds. One was the extraordinary degree to which problems of lifting and carrying things absorbed our energy. The other was the fact that we had only one kind of Hnau. They thought this must have far-reaching effects in the narrowing of sympathies and even of thought.
Your thought must be at the mercy of your blood,
said the old Sorn.
For you cannot compare it with thought that floats on a different blood.
It was a tiring and very disagreeable conversation for Ransom. But when at last he lay down to sleep, it was not of the human nakedness nor of his own ignorance that he was thinking. He thought only of the old forests of Malacandra, and of what it might mean to grow up seeing always so few miles away a land of colour that could never be reached and had once been inhabited. 17. Early next day, Ransom again took his seat on Augrey's shoulder. For more than an hour they travelled through the same bright wilderness. Far to the north, the sky was luminous with a cloud-like mass of dull red or ochre. It was very large and drove furiously westward, about 10 miles above the waist. Ransom, who had yet seen no cloud in the Malacandran sky, asked what it was. The sorn told him it was sand caught up from the great northern deserts by the winds of that terrible country. It was often thus carried, sometimes at a height of 17 miles, to fall again perhaps in a handramit as a choking and blinding dust storm. The sight of it moving with menace in the naked sky served to remind Ransom that they were indeed on the outside of Malacandra, no longer dwelling in a world, but crawling the surface of a strange planet. At last the cloud seemed to drop and burst far on the western horizon, where a glow, not unlike that of a conflagration, remained visible until a turn of the valley hid all that region from his view. The same turn opened a new prospect to his eyes. What lay before him looked at first strangely like an earthly landscape, a landscape of grey downland ridges rising and falling like waves of the sea. Far beyond, cliffs and spires of the familiar green rock rose against the dark blue sky. A moment later he saw that what he had taken for downlands was but the ridged and furrowed surface of a blue-grey valley mist, a mist which would not appear a mist at all when they descended into the Handramit. And already, as their road began descending, it was less visible, and the many-coloured pattern of the low country showed vaguely through it. The descent grew quickly steeper. Like the jagged teeth of a giant with very bad teeth, the topmost peaks of the mountain wall down which they must pass loomed up over the edge of their gully. The look of the sky and the quality of the light were infinitesimally changed. A moment later they stood on the edge of such a slope as by earthly standards would rather be called a precipice. Down and down this face, to where it vanished in a purple blush of vegetation, ran their road. Ransom refused absolutely to make the descent on Algray's shoulder. The sorn, though it did not fully understand his objection, stooped for him to dismount, and proceeded, with the same skating and forward-sloping motion, to go down before him. Ransom followed, using gladly but stiffly his numb legs. The beauty of this new Handramit as it opened before him took his breath away. It was wider than that in which he had hitherto lived, and right below him lay an almost circular lake, a sapphire 12 miles in diameter, set in a border of purple forest. Amidst the lake there rose like a low and gently sloping pyramid, or like a woman's breast, an island of pale red, smooth to the summit, and on the summit a grove of such trees as man had never seen. Their smooth columns had the gentle swell of the noblest beech trees, but these were taller than a cathedral spire on earth, and at their tops they broke rather into flower than foliage, into golden flower, bright as tulip, still as rock, and huge as summer cloud. Flowers indeed they were, not trees, and far down among their roots he caught a pale hint of slab-like architecture. He knew before his guide told him that this was Meldilorn. He did not know what he had expected. The old dreams which he had brought from Earth of some more than American complexity of offices, or some engineer's paradise of vast machines, had indeed been long laid aside. But he had not looked for anything quite so classic, so virginal as this bright grove, lying so still, so secret in its coloured valley, soaring with inimitable grace so many 100 feet into the wintry sunlight. At every step of his descent The comparative warmth of the valley came up to him more deliciously. He looked above. The sky was turning to a paler blue. He saw below, and sweet and faint the thin fragrance of the giant blooms came up to him. Distant crags were growing less sharp in outline, and surfaces less bright. Depth, dimness, softness, and perspective were returning to the landscape. The lip or edge of rock from which they had started their descent was already far overhead. It seemed unlikely that they had really come from there. He was breathing freely. His toes, so long benumbed, could move delightfully inside his boots. He lifted the ear flaps of his cap and found his ears instantly filled with the sound of falling water. And now he was treading on soft groundweed over level earth, and the forest roof was above his head. They had conquered the Harandra and were on the threshold of Meldilorn. A short walk brought them into a kind of forest ride, a broad avenue running straight as an arrow through the purple stems to where the vivid blue of the lake danced at the end of it. There they found a gong and hammer hung on a pillar of stone. These objects were all richly decorated, and the gong and hammer were of a greenish-blue metal which Ransom did not recognize. Algrey struck the gong. An excitement was rising in Ransom's mind, which almost prevented him from examining as coolly as he wished the ornamentation of the stone. It was partly pictorial, partly pure decoration. What chiefly struck him was a certain balance of packed and empty spaces. Pure line drawings, as bare as the prehistoric pictures of reindeer on Earth, alternated with patches of design as close and intricate as Norse or Celtic jewellery. And then, as you looked at it, these empty and crowded areas turned out to be themselves arranged in larger designs. He was struck by the fact that the pictorial work was not confined to the emptier spaces. Quite often large arabesques included as a subordinate detail intricate pictures. Elsewhere the opposite plan had been followed. And this alternation too had a rhythmical or patterned element in it. He was just beginning to find out that the pictures, though stylized, were obviously intended to tell a story, when Algrey interrupted him. A ship had put out from the island shore of Meldilorn. As it came towards them, Ransom's heart warmed to see that it was paddled by a hross. The creature brought its boat up to the shore where they were waiting, stared at Ransom, and then looked inquiringly at Algrey.
"You may well wonder at this now, Hrinra,"
said the Sorn,
"for you have never seen anything like it. It is called Rensum, and has come through heaven from Thalcandra."
"It is welcome, Algrey,"
said the hross politely.
"Is it coming to Oasa?"
"He has sent for it."
"And for you also, Algrey?"
"Oasa has not called me. If you will take Rensum over the water, I will go back to my tower."
The hross indicated that Ransom should enter the boat. He attempted to express his thanks to the Sorn, and after a moment's consideration, unstrapped his wristwatch and offered it to him. It was the only thing he had, which seemed a suitable present for a Sorn. He had no difficulty in making Algrey understand its purpose, but after examining it, the giant gave it back to him, a little reluctantly, and said,
"This gift ought to be given to a Pfiffeltrig. It rejoices my heart, but they would make more of it. You are likely to meet some of the busy people in Meldilorn. Give it to them. As for its use, do your people not know, except by looking at this thing, how much of the day has worn?"
"I believe there are beasts that have a sort of knowledge of that,"
said Ransom.
"but our now have lost it."
After this, his farewells to the Sorn were made, and he embarked. To be once more in a boat with a Ross, to feel the warmth of water on his face, and to see a blue sky above him was almost like coming home. He took off his cap and leaned back luxuriously in the bows, plying his escort with questions. He learned that the Hrossa were not specially concerned with the service of Oasa, as he had surmised from finding a Hross in charge of the ferry. All three species of Hnau served him in their various capacities, and the ferry was naturally entrusted to those who understood boats. He learned that his own procedure on arriving in Meldilorn must be to go where he liked and do what he pleased, until Oasa called for him. It might be an hour or several days before this happened. He would find huts near the landing place where he could sleep if necessary, and where food would be given him. In return, he related as much as he could make intelligible of his own world and his journey from it, and he warned the Hross of the dangerous bent men who had brought him and who were still at large on Malacandra. As he did so, it occurred to him that he had not made this sufficiently clear to Algre, but he consoled himself with the reflection that Western and Divine seemed to have already some liaison with the Sorns, and that they would not be likely to molest things so large and so comparatively man-like. At any rate, not yet. About Divine's ultimate designs he had no illusions. All he could do was to make a clean breast of them to Oasa. And now the ship touched land. Ransom rose while the Hross was making fast and looked about him. Close to the little harbour which they had entered and to the left were low buildings of stone, the first he had seen in Malacandra, and fires were burning. There, the Hross told him, he could find food and shelter. For the rest, the island seemed desolate, and its smooth slopes empty up to the grove that crowned them, where again he saw stonework. But this appeared to be neither temple nor house in the human sense, but a broad avenue of monoliths, a much larger Stonehenge, stately, empty, and vanishing over the crest of the hill into the pale shadow of the flower trunks. All was solitude, but as he gazed upon it, he seemed to hear against the background of morning silence a faint, continual agitation of silvery sound, hardly a sound at all, if you attended to it, and yet impossible to ignore.
The island is full of Erdilla,
said the Hross in a hushed voice. He went ashore. As though half expecting some obstacle, he took a few hesitant paces forward and stopped, and then went on again in the same fashion. Though the groundweed was unusually soft and rich, and his feet made no noise upon it, he felt an impulse to walk on tiptoes. All his movements became gentle and sedate. The width of water about this island made the air warmer than any he had yet breathed in Malacandra. The climate was almost that of a warm earthly day in late September, a day that is warm but with a hint of frost to come. The sense of awe which was increasing upon him deterred him from approaching the crown of the hill, the grove, and the avenue of standing stones. He ceased ascending about halfway up the hill and began walking to his right, keeping a constant distance from the shore. He said to himself that he was having a look at the island, but his feeling was rather that the island was having a look at him. This was greatly increased by a discovery he made after he had been walking for about an hour, and which he ever afterwards found great difficulty in describing. In the most abstract terms, it might be summed up by saying that the surface of the island was subject to tiny variations of light and shade, which no change in the sky accounted for. If the air had not been calm and the groundweed too short and firm to move in the wind, he would have said that a faint breeze was playing with it, and working such slight alterations in the shading as it does in a cornfield on the earth. Like the silvery noises in the air, these footsteps of light were shy of observation. Where he looked hardest, they were least to be seen. On the edges of his field of vision they came crowding as though a complex arrangement of them were there in progress. To attend to any one of them was to make it invisible, and the minute brightness seemed often to have just left the spot where his eyes fell. He had no doubt that he was seeing, as much as he ever would see, the Eldilla. The sensation it produced in him was curious. It was not exactly uncanny, not as if he were surrounded by ghosts. It was not even as if he were being spied upon. He had rather the sense of being looked at by things that had a right to look. His feeling was less than fear. It had in it something of embarrassment, something of shyness, something of submission, and it was profoundly uneasy. He felt tired, and thought that in this favoured land it would be warm enough to rest out of doors. He sat down. The softness of the weed, the warmth and sweet smell which pervaded the whole island, reminded him of earth and gardens in summer. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them again and noticed buildings below him, and over the lake he saw a boat approaching. Recognition suddenly came to him. That was the ferry, and these buildings were the guest house beside the harbour. He had walked all round the island. A certain disappointment succeeded this discovery. He was beginning to feel hungry. Perhaps it would be a good plan to go down and ask for some food. At any rate, it would pass the time, but he did not do so. When he rose and looked more closely at the guest house, he saw a considerable stir of creatures about it, and while he watched, he saw that a full load of passengers was landing from the ferry boat. In the lake he saw some moving objects which he did not at first identify, but which turned out to be sorns up to their middles in the water and obviously wading to Meldilorn from the mainland. There were about 10 of them. For some reason or other, the island was receiving an influx of visitors. He no longer supposed that any harm would be done to him if he went down and mixed in the crowd, but he felt a reluctance to do so. The situation brought vividly back to his mind his experience as a new boy at school. New boys came a day early, hanging about and watching the arrival of the old hands. In the end, he decided not to go down. He cut and ate some of the groundweed and dozed for a little. In the afternoon, when it grew colder, he resumed his walking. Other Hnau were roaming about the island by this time. He saw Sorns chiefly, but this was because their height made them conspicuous. There was hardly any noise. His reluctance to meet these fellow wanderers, who seemed to confine themselves to the coast of the island, drove him half-consciously upwards and inwards. He found himself at last on the fringes of the grove and looking straight up the monolithic avenue. He had intended, for no very clearly defined reason, not to enter it, but he fell to studying the stone nearest to him, which was richly sculptured on all its 4 sides, and after that curiosity led him on from stone to stone. The pictures were very puzzling. Side by side with representations of Sorns and Oasa, and what he supposed to be petrified, there occurred again and again an upright, wavy figure with only the suggestion of a face, and with wings. The wings were perfectly recognizable, and this puzzled him very much. Could it be that the traditions of Malacandrian art went back to that earlier geological and biological era when, as Algray had told him, there was life, including bird life, on the Harandra? The answer of the stones seemed to be yes. He saw pictures of the old red forests with unmistakable birds flying among them, and many other creatures that he did not know. On another stone, many of these were represented lying dead, and a fantastic Hanakra-like figure, presumably as symbolizing the cold, was depicted in the sky above them, shooting at them with darts. Creatures still alive were crowding round the winged, wavy figure, which he took to be Oasa, pictured as a winged flame. On the next stone, Oasa appeared, followed by many creatures, and apparently making a furrow with some pointed instrument. Another picture showed the furrow being enlarged by Pififultrigi with digging tools. Sorns were plying the earth up in pinnacles on each side, and Hrossa seemed to be making water channels. Ransom wondered whether this were a mythical account of the making of the Handramits, or whether they were conceivably artificial in fact. Many of the pictures he could make nothing of. Some that particularly puzzled him showed at the bottom a segment of a circle, behind and above which rose 3/4 of a disk divided into concentric rings. He thought it was a picture of the sun rising behind a hill. Certainly the segment at the bottom was full of Malacandrian scenes. Oasa and Meldilorn, Sorns on the mountain edge of the Harandra, and many other things both familiar to him and strange. He turned from it to examine the disk which rose behind it. It was not the sun. The sun was there unmistakably at the center of the disk. Round this the concentric circles revolved. In the first and smallest of these was pictured a little ball, on which rode a winged figure something like Oasa, but holding what appeared to be a trumpet. In the next a similar ball carried another of the flaming figures. This one, instead of even the suggested face, had 2 bulges, which after long inspection he decided were meant to be udders or breasts of a female mammal. By this time he was quite sure that he was looking at a picture of the solar system. The first ball was Mercury, the second Venus, and what an extraordinary coincidence, thought Ransom, that their mythology, like ours, associates some idea of the female with Venus. The problem would have occupied him longer if a natural curiosity had not drawn his eyes onto the next ball, which must represent the Earth. When he saw it, his whole mind stood still for a moment. The ball was there, but where the flame-like figure should have been, a deep depression of irregular shape had been cut as if to erase it. Once then, but his speculations faltered and became silent before a series of unknowns. He looked at the next circle. Here there was no ball. Instead, the bottom of this circle touched the top of the big segment filled with Malacandran scenes, so that Malacandra at this point touched the solar system and came out of it in perspective towards the spectator. Now that his mind had grasped the design, he was astonished at the vividness of it all. He stood back and drew a deep breath, preparatory to tackling some of the mysteries in which he was engulfed. Malacandra, then, was Mars. The Earth, but at this point a sound of tapping or hammering, which had been going on for some time without gaining admission to his consciousness, became too insistent to be ignored. Some creature, and certainly not an Eldil, was at work close to him. A little startled, for he had been deep in thought, he turned round. there was nothing to be seen. He shouted out, idiotically, in English.
Who's there?
The tapping instantly stopped, and a remarkable face appeared from behind a neighbouring monolith. It was hairless like a man's or a sorn's. It was long and pointed like a shrew's, yellow and shabby-looking, and so long in the forehead that but for the heavy development of the head at the back and behind the ears, like a bagwig, it could not have been that of an intelligent creature. A moment later, the whole of the thing came into view with a startling jump. Ransom guessed that it was a petrified, and was glad that he had not met one of this third race on his first arrival in Malacandra. It was much more insect-like or reptilian than anything he had yet seen. Its build was distinctly that of a frog, and at first Ransom thought it was resting, frog-like, on its hands. Then he noticed that part of its forelimbs on which it was supported was really, in human terms, rather an elbow than a hand. It was broad and padded and clearly made to be walked on, but upwards from it, at an angle of about 45 degrees, went the true forearms, thin, strong forearms, ending in enormous, sensitive, many-fingered hands. He realized that for all manual work, from mining to cutting cameos, this creature had the advantage of being able to work with its full strength from a supported elbow. The insect-like effect was due to the speed and jerkiness of its movements, and to the fact that it could swivel its head almost all the way round, like a mantis. And it was increased by a kind of dry, rasping, jingling quality in the noise of its moving. It was rather like a grasshopper, rather like one of Arthur Rackham's dwarfs, rather like a frog, and rather like a little old taxidermist whom Ransom knew in London.
I come from another world,
began Ransom.
I know,
said the creature in a quick, twittering, rather impatient voice.
Come here, behind the stone. This way, Oasa's orders. Very busy. Must begin at once. Stand there.
Ransom found himself on the other side of the monolith, staring at a picture which was still in process of completion. The ground was liberally strewn with chips, and the air was full of dust.
There,
said the creature.
Stand still. Don't look at me. Look over there.
For a moment, Ransom did not quite understand what was expected of him. Then, as he saw the petrified glancing to and fro at him and at the stone with the unmistakable glance of artist from model to work, which is the same in all worlds, he realized and almost laughed. He was standing for his portrait. From his position he could see that the creature was cutting the stone as if it were cheese, and the swiftness of its movements almost baffled his eyes. But he could get no impression of the work done, though he could study the petrified. He saw that the jingling metallic noise was due to the number of small instruments which it carried about its body. Sometimes, with an exclamation of annoyance, it would throw down the tool it was working with and select one of these, but the majority of those in immediate use it kept in its mouth. He realized also that this was an animal artificially clothed like himself, in some bright scaly substance which appeared richly decorated, though coated in dust. It had folds of furry clothing about its throat like a comforter, and its eyes were protected by dark bulging goggles. Rings and chains of a bright metal, not gold, he thought, adorned its limbs and neck. All the time it was working it kept up a sort of hissing whisper to itself, and when it was excited, which it usually was, the end of its nose wrinkled like a rabbit's, At last it gave another startling leap, landed about 10 yards away from its work, and said,
Yes, not so good as I hoped. Do better another time. Leave it now. Come and see yourself.
Ransom obeyed. He saw a picture of the planets, not now arranged to make a map of the solar system, but advancing in a single procession towards the spectator, and all save one bearing its fiery charioteer. Below lay Malacandra, and there, to his surprise, was a very tolerable picture of the spaceship. Beside it stood 3 figures, for all of which Ransom had apparently been the model. He recoiled from them in disgust. Even allowing for the strangeness of the subject from a Malacandrian point of view, and for the stylization of their art, still he thought the creature might have made a better attempt at the human form than those stock-like dummies, almost as thick as they were tall, and sprouting about the head and neck into something that looked like fungus. He hedged.
I expect it is like me as I look to your people,
he said.
It is not how they would draw me in my own world.
No,
said the Pfiffeltrig.
I do not mean it to be too like, and they will not believe it, those who were born after.
He added a good deal more which was difficult to understand, but while he was speaking it dawned upon Ransom that the odious figures were intended as an idealization of humanity. Conversation languished for a little. To change the subject, Ransom asked a question which had been in his mind for some time.
I cannot understand,
he said,
how you and the Sorns and the Oasa all come to speak the same speech, for your tongues and teeth and throats must be very different.
Oh, you are right,
said the creature.
Once we all had different speeches, and we still have at home. But everyone has learned the speech of the Oasa.
Why is that?
said Ransom, still thinking in terms of terrestrial history.
Did the Oasa once rule the others?
I do not understand. They are our great speakers and singers. They have more words and better. No one learns the speech of my people. For what we have to say is set in stone, and sun's blood and stars' milk, and all can see them. No one learns the Sorns' speech, for you can change their knowledge into any words, and it is still the same. You cannot do that with the songs of the Oasa. Their tongue goes all over Malacandra. I speak it to you because you are a stranger. I would speak it to a Sorn, but we have our own tongues at home. You can see it in the names. The Sorns have big-sounding names like Ogre and Arkal and Belmo and Falme. The Oasa have furry names like No and Nihi and Huey and Hlifnahi.
The best poetry, then, comes in the roughest speech?
Perhaps,
said the Pfiffeltrig,
as the best pictures are made in the hardest stone. But my people have names like Gallagher and Paracatoru and Teferakaruf. I am called Kanakabaraka.
Ransom told it his name.
In my country,
said Kanakabaraka,
it is not like this. We are not pinched in a narrow hand mitt. There are the true forests, the green shadows, the deep mines. It is warm. It does not blaze with lights like this, and it is not silent like this. I could put you in a place there in the forests where you could see 100 fires at once and hear 100 hammers. I wish you had come to our country. We do not live in holes like the Sorns, nor in bundles of weed like the Oasa. I could show you houses with 100 pillars, one of sun's blood, the next of star's milk, all the way, and all the world painted on the walls.
How do you rule yourselves?
Asked Ransom.
Those who are digging in the mines, do they like it as much as those who paint the walls?
Oh, keep the mines open. It is a work to be shared. But he digs for himself the thing he wants for his work. What else would he do?
It is not so with us.
Then you must make very bent work. How would a maker understand working in sun's blood unless he went into the home of sun's blood himself and knew one kind from another and lived with it for days out of the light of the sky till it was in his blood and his heart, as if he thought it and ate it and spat it.
Thus it lies very deep and hard to get, and those who dig it must spend their whole lives on this skill.
And they love it.
I think not. I do not know. They are kept at it because they are given no food. If they stop...
Kanaka Baraka wrinkled his nose.
Then there is not food in plenty on your world.
I do not know,
said Ransom.
I've often wished to know the answer to that question, but no one can tell me. Does no one keep your people at their work, Kanaka Baraka?
Our females,
said the Pefefutrig, with a piping noise which was apparently his equivalent for a laugh.
Are your females of more account among you than those of the other Hanau among them?
very greatly. The Sorns make least account of females, and we make most.
Your friend and mine, Moon's cat, is hidden somewhere in this video. Did you see him? If you didn't, it's okay. Go back to the start and watch the video again, and when you do see him, write the time code in which he appears in the comments field. And if you get it right, you get the chance to have the next video dedicated to you or someone you care about. He is quick and hard to spot, as you will see the places he hid here, here, and here. Best of luck finding him. And don't forget,
Look out for the shadows.